Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
So the results are in, and by one measure at least, Vladimir Putin's plebiscite to change the Russian constitution and effectively make himself president for life was a success. The latest results show that nearly 78% of Russians backed the changes, but that, after all, was expected. If there is one thing that Putin's Kremlin knows how to do, it is how to rig a vote. The real measure of success in any Russian election is not the results, which few really trust after all, but how effective it was as a legitimization ritual. How effectively did the Kremlin use dramaturgy and political theater to justify Putin's right to rule? How successful was the regime in creating the illusion of legitimacy? Because Russia doesn't really have elections. It periodically screens a movie about an election, and the movie needs to have a plot, and the plot has to be compelling. So how good or how bad was Putin's latest movie? Hello from my makeshift studio in my condo in Washington, D.C.'s awesome Adams Morgan neighborhood, and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program at SIPA. And joining us from D.C.'s lovely DuPont Circle neighborhood just down the street from me is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow at SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Maria.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
And also joining us today from Vilnius, Lithuania, one of my favorite cities, is veteran Russian journalist Maxim Trudolyubov, a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute and editor-at-large at Meduza. Welcome back to the podcast, Max. It's been way, way too long.
Hello, thank you for having me. Hi.
So, Maria, let's start with you. I know we've all been following this really closely, and I was following your social media feeds yesterday, as I always do, and as everybody should do who wants to be informed about what's going on in Russia. And you posted some exit poll results, some very early exit poll results, showing that Moscow and your native St. Petersburg voted decisively no. 55% no in Moscow and 63% in St. Petersburg. So Petersburg got the pride of place there. I know there's a healthy competition between these two cities. There's been official results have come in, and surprise, surprise, both cities apparently voted yes, which is kind of surprising. In fact, according to Meduza, the only protest vote was in the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, where 54.57 voted no. New York City, by the way, also voted no. And I haven't seen results for Washington, for Russian citizens in Washington. But Maria, I just want to come back to you. Judging from those early exit poll results, I guess from your perspective, the movie was kind of lame. Or how did Putin do with his movie?
Of course. Thank you very much, Brian, for really brilliantly describing the situation in Russia. We never doubted in the first place that the whole situation was going to be falsified, which it was, through primarily everything else but the real voting by coming to the precincts. So as we have discussed before, there was a whole week of this voting everywhere across Russia, done in a very awkward manner, people voting everywhere in the cars, trunks, somewhere outside of the buildings, in the villages, somewhere even on the soccer fields, with zero monitoring. They also added to that the electronic voting, which is also extremely hard to monitor since we really don't know, we have no access to the data that the authorities publish. And finally, only 10% of overall population actually voted yesterday in a traditional fashion. It was done on purpose, and the results were, as predicted, even more, I would say bolder than we predicted, because as of now, the official results are 78% of Russians who allegedly supported this amendments. Of course, this has nothing to do with the reality. And Sergei Shpilkin, probably Russia's one of the best electoral statisticians at this point, he has published the data. They already pre-analyzed the data, essentially showing this split, showing with the essentially where the fake data comes, and of course the turnout is very highly correlated with the higher percentage of vote for the authorities, which always is an indicator of falsifications. In this today, Sergei Shpilkin wrote that this level of falsifications is unprecedented for all of the previous elections he has seen, which honestly is a relatively high bar to take.
That's a very high bar. I noticed Chechnya was 97.92% for, with a turnout of 95.14%. Kadyrov said that Putin should be made president for life. So yeah, I mean, that's par for the course for Chechnya. But do you think the optics were good? I mean, they always fix elections. That's a given. How good was the movie? Did the movie work?
It's a good question, and to me personally, it's a very personal feeling, I would say. And I also am not in Russia at the moment. I'm in DC, so here the optics may be a little bit biased. I know that a lot of my colleagues are very frustrated this morning to see 78%, but then again, it's so ridiculous at this point. This is just, beyond being frustrated. But yesterday there was something extra that I felt, and I think it was important. It's important to keep in mind that some major opposition figures in Russia, like Alexei Navalny, did not support this coming to the election. So the position was split yet again about what's the best way to behave. Some people actively supported coming to the electoral precincts. Others did not take a strong position on it. But despite the fact that people like Alexei Navalny, who have larger support in Russia, did not openly call to come and vote, yesterday a lot of people turned out, and the other group of the opposition politicians who organized this campaign called No, meaning come and vote no, they actually succeeded in also organizing these exit polls, which demonstrated, as you have said yourself, this result that in both Moscow and St. Petersburg, people were at least divided 50-50, and at the most actually voted against.
Much worse than 50-50 in Petersburg.
Yeah.
Maria, let me interrupt you for a moment. I mean, on these exit polls, were they only done in St. Petersburg, or were they done elsewhere? Do they suggest anything about Moscow and St. Petersburg, but no place else?
This is where, unfortunately, the strongest mobilized community of Russians live.
Because it would be interesting to get almost an alternative vote count of how things went Russia-wide. It would be interesting. But the Moscow and St. Petersburg numbers are telling you.
Russia-wide, we have Sergei Shpilkin, and he says as of now, about 45% of votes has been falsified according to his data. And if the election was clean, countrywide, we would receive 65 against 35%.
65-4.
65-4,
okay.
as opposed to 78 that we got as of now. So that still means that in Russia's situation, without any media access, without any free information, you have over a third of people who are against these amendments.
And you got Navalny boycotting, which also has a big
That's
big
true.
effect. Let's bring Max into the conversation now. Same question, Max. I mean, you're a little closer there in Vilnius than we are here in DC to find. I know you've been following this. I mean, I saw just a few things I've noticed out there. I mean, of course, there was the famous protest on Red Square with the people spelling 2036 with their bodies yesterday. There were electoral shenanigans, like the Electoral Commission stopping automatic downloads of the results. You had journalists assaulted at polling sites. But from where I sit, there was nothing on the level that made like 2011 such a disaster. The carousel voting captured on video and social media and all of that. How did the movie look from your perspective? This metaphor of the movie, did the movie have a good plot or a bad plot for the Kremlin?
Well, hello again, Brian.
Hi, Max.
Hello, everyone. I don't think that it was really a successful, if you use that analogy, a successful movie. No, not really. But you see, what I think the Kremlin has succeeded in achieving is that we don't really have a common ground with the Kremlin, with those who support Putin, to argue about things anymore. Their figures are their figures. I include myself in the numbers of those who do not really trust the figures, but I don't have a really good tool, an instrument to check that and compare and say, okay, I got this measure or that measure. Exit polls are all nice, and there are other studies conducted before the event, and we kind of have an idea of how the big cities voted, kind of a rough idea, but nothing really to compare it to those results. So what they, I think, to me, have succeeded in doing is that we just have their word, our word, their word, our. We can argue as much as we like. Also, there was this one thing that I would think is important, is that I don't even know, can you really call this cheating? It's a kind of a manipulation, because when they were throughout the campaign, the talk was about those amendments, mainly about the social measures of various kinds, the motherland, the God of the Constitution, the language, the Russian people as the founding nation, founding ethnos of. Those are all those things that make part of those new amendments.
I actually saw those things. I saw those things as part of an attempt to kind of instill an ideological facade.
What I'm saying is that Putin resetting the tally of his terms back to zero was not really part of the campaign. It was mentioned briefly, but he himself mentioned it on an interview. It was never really campaigned for. It was not the slogan. It was not.
Do you think anybody in Russia doubted that was what this was about? I mean, do you think there's anybody in Russia, even supporters of Putin?
Right. What I'm saying is that they were campaigning, at least officially, on the surface of things. They were campaigning for one thing and winning the other, and now they are claiming Putin's triumph. Although during the campaign, it was never about Putin's personal triumph. It was
a bait and switch operation.
Yeah, it was all kinds of things, not Putin's. Now it is. Right now, that's exactly. So I'm not sure. I'm being a purist, but I would have a poll. I would like to see a poll asking people, what did you actually voted for those who did? Because you had all kinds of things that were discussed. People were watching TV and they were discussing, maybe they voted, for the Constitution in general, or maybe they voted against America, or they voted against gay unions.
I mean, that's a great idea. If our friends from the Levada Center are out there, I'd also like to see that poll of what did Russians think they were voting for. That's a good point. I actually think Max raises a really important issue here, though, and it's something that we discussed last week on the podcast with Vladimir Karamurza, and that is this: how seriously should we take these rituals? I mean, the Soviet Union had elections, and the Soviet Union called those things elections, but nobody outside the Soviet Union took them seriously, covered them as elections. They just treated them as something ridiculous. And many people inside the Soviet Union considered them just to be something ridiculous. And by getting caught up in the numbers, as I started us off talking all about the numbers, are we playing Putin's game, or should we just treat this as something ridiculous and some game the elites are playing? Because for them, Putin is obsessed with legitimacy. He's obsessed with being able to create this facade of legitimacy around himself. And legitimacy doesn't work if people don't see this ritual as something that truly bestows legitimacy on him. Again, this is the same kind of issue I raised last week. Maria, what do you? I know you've been thinking about this as well, because we've been talking about it a lot.
Well, Brian, as we have discussed, as a matter of fact, the elections are a good thing for dictators in the sense that they do kind of legitimize sustained power, but they're also dangerous because we have discussed last time, they create this collective action point where it's very easy for people, and including the opposition, who don't like this leader, to mobilize around this time. And so it's potentially a damaging tool that's something that may undermine the claim for legitimacy, expose the lack of popularity, and also potentially overturn his rule because of the revolution that follows after the election. So I don't think yesterday Putin has been able to achieve his goal at all. 78% is absolutely clearly a ridiculous number. It's very easy to see that in the graphs. As I said before, the growth of turnout, which is directly correlated with the growth of support for the amendments, is a very clear indication of falsifications. And at the same time, we saw that in big cities, people turned out and said no. As a matter of fact, it's actually getting increasingly hard to find a person who says yes in St. Petersburg and Moscow these days. It actually becomes, quite inappropriate. Like, is this something's wrong with you? That why would you possibly support those amendments? I'm not saying the situation is countrywide, but that's certainly the case in big cities. As we have said before, it's not something we observed in the past. That this has been all falsified, I think is absolutely clear to most Russians. And I don't know, it's my personal feeling, but yesterday I felt something different. And not just me, a lot of people posted on Facebook, like they went to monitor these elections in Moscow, like really not hoping for anything good. But once they were there and they saw how many people actually turned out to vote against, it shows you that you're part of the community, and this community grows. This has been a very, very strong perception I've been getting in Russia in the recent years in general. And yesterday as well, it actually was felt even through social networks. But the problem is, of course, if you want something else, if you want this not just to stop here, you need to go out in the streets. This is very clear, and people just not ready to do that. At this point, this is also clear. We are going to have to wait until they're ready.
So you think this could have to use the Russian phrase, an обратный результат. This can really be this. I mean, it might not be apparent immediately, as Vladimir Karamazov made the point last week. This is not going to become manifest this week or next month or maybe even this year or next year. But there is this kind of, you feel this slow erosion. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Brezhnev time. I didn't live in the Soviet Union in Brezhnev time, but I remember watching the Brezhnev time from here. And it kind of feels like that late kind of zastoy period is setting in right now. Now, that took a long time, though. So
also, just remember that where we started, right? We just had a couple of years ago, we had 86% for Putin, a percentage of support for Putin, and now we've got 59. Essentially de facto, 50, 65, whatever it is. So there's a huge decline in support. Also, I have to say the opposition that supported not coming to the election actually might have lost some support among people. It wasn't popular this time around. A lot of people understood this is a big turning point in Russia's political system, and not backing. The turnout didn't look good. I know a lot of friends who just said they were disappointed by the way some opposition leaders acted this time around. So that's also understood as something where it really doesn't matter what the outcomes are. What matters is that it's your civil duty to some extent to come, to show, and to raise your voice against what's going on.
Max, would you agree with that? Is Maria right that these elections, even though they're fake, even though they're rigged, even though they're a sham, even though they're just a ritual, it is still important for Russians who want a more pluralistic and democratic future to come out and vote in these things anyway? Or would you take and I'm not sure I believe my position, quite frankly, but I've been toying with this, that we should just ignore this, that say this is just ridiculous. And we're going to ignore it. We're not going to play your little legitimization game. We don't want to be extras in your movie. How would you come down on that, Max?
Well, yeah. Well, you see, among my friends, it's like 50-50, half and half. Many decided to go and vote. I myself didn't, quite frankly. Well, simply because I really didn't believe in this. This was all wrong from the very start. I didn't think there was a good. It was a merit behind this, and the procedure itself completely ridiculous. So I just, for myself, and only for myself, I just decided I'm not going to be part of that. But I'm sure there are people and they have very good reasons to come and show that they're good friends of mine. I would say voted.
Well, it's interesting because the two of you, I know Maria voted because I saw her ballot posted on her Facebook page, and now I know you didn't vote. So you two basically play out this dynamic that's been playing among Russians of this generation and of this political
right. And personally, I don't think that I did this because Alexei Navalny, he wasn't part. He said that he boycotted that. Some of his supporters, by the way, didn't listen to him and went and voted. Okay, maybe that was a missed opportunity. I'm not sure. But my thinking basically was not really about the procedure, because I was thinking that the procedure was wrong in the first place. I was mostly thinking about the actual outcome, the prospect of Vladimir Putin staying for possibly 2 more terms, and essentially he's been canceling. He extended his term in office by 2 more terms, 6 years each, which plus the 4 years is still to go before 2024. So it's 16 years potentially, and this is something. This brings us. This very thing brings us into the kind of territory that is, to me, I think it changes something. If we look in the history of all those cases when people would extend their presidential terms, we would see many Latin American leaders, many Latin American leaders. That's something that's actually, Latin America is the home, if you could say that.
Or if you believe Maria, African leaders, which she thinks is the closest model to Russia.
Okay, but there are lots of Latin American, Maria, in Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, many others. And quite recently it was Hugo Chavez, it was Evo Morales of Bolivia, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Morales of Bolivia, somebody else I forget right now. But historically it's been, there's this term, continualismo, that's been coined specifically by political scientists who were looking at Latin, but it doesn't matter. Basically, this is taking us to a territory where we find people like Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, we find Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, Pang Chung-hee of South Korea, Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, and many post-Soviet leaders, by the way, who've been extending their presidential terms. Alexander Lukashenko,
of course, he wrote the book on how to do it.
He's essentially a serial extender of his presidential terms. He started by just adding more, and then basically canceled all the limits.
Right.
So I think this practice of canceling the limits is kind of taking you in a different situation. So before that, Putin was still kind of a junior extender, because he only, as it were, he only used, he just lengthened the terms themselves from 4 years to 6 back in 2008. He, arguably used a placeholder in the person of Dmitry Medvedev. We can argue about that. Many people think that Dmitry Medvedev was a genuine president anyway, but Putin came back in 2012 as president again, and then served, he will have served twice the new lengthened term of 6 years. And then he will have the right to run again for 6 years, and then 6 years again. And well, essentially, we are getting into a kind of a perpetual Putin, which is never good. I think it's really never good for the country, because it creates a different dynamic. The leader becomes part. He himself starts thinking about himself as part of the country interchangeably, but he almost equals the country. The country equals him, and the elites kind of stick with him, and the threats to him are the threats to the country. So to me, despite whatever they're saying, that this is all about stability, it creates this internal instability, and also the studies show that it creates risk of an early ouster, by the way, because the longer they stay, the more is this chance of them leading, sort of, let's say, call it a bad exit. So I would think that we are now looking at a prospect of some kind of bad exit at some unknown point in the future.
Max, you raised several interesting points. I just want to make a couple of points because you provided me a good segue into the other aspect of this I wanted to talk about. But first of all, on Navalny, I mean, I think it's very interesting. Behavior has changed on this is very interesting, because if you remember back in 2011, there was this big debate between Navalny and Boris Nemtsov about whether to come to boycott the election or go to the election and vote for anybody but United Russia. And Navalny was arguing the latter. And Navalny actually was right in that argument. And it proved to be a very successful tactic. This time, he's actually arguing to do exactly the opposite thing, and I think that's interesting. I mean, if I had Alexei Anatolovich here on the podcast with us, I would ask him that question, like why he changed that tactic. Max, you raised the interesting question that this could lead to them leaving in a bad way, because basically, I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. I wrote a column called "Putin Unmasked." And effectively playing off of Putin's comments on Russia One, where he said, basically, well, we can't have the elite thinking about succession, so we just can't. We have to get that out of the way. And Putin is effectively saying, I have to rule forever because I have to rule forever. There's no justification, right? Putin's first mandate was all about rising living standards, right, and restoring order and pulling Russia out of the so-called chaos of the 90s. And then his second mandate, which started with Crimea, was about restoring the Russian Empire. What's the mandate here? There's no mandate. It's like, I have to rule forever because I have to rule forever. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous. You could keep doing this if you have an ideological justification to legitimize your rule, at least internally legitimize that enough people have buy-in to your right to rule. I mean, this is why Brezhnev was able to last so long, because he did have, Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution effectively, as his ideological justification. But there's nothing. He's got nothing right now, and this is a very perilous time. You mentioned the elite, and this is exactly where I wanted to go, because Tatiana Snegovaya, who one of my favorite observers of the Russian elite, had a piece on the Carnegie website this week about this, where she was arguing this is all about keeping the elite in line. This is all about preventing Putin from becoming a lame duck in the eyes of the elite, so they're not maneuvering around who's going to be the next leader. And she writes, and this is how she concludes, and I think it's really spot on. Putin's general aim in holding the nationwide vote is to cement the state of affairs that followed Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, which sent his approval rating soaring. In reality, that world has long been eroded. This attempt to retain a vanishing past scares many, not just among the opposition, but also within the establishment, where there is a desire to move forward. For now, we are not talking so much about an elite rebellion as of their instinct for self-preservation, as they see that old political tools are worn out and can no longer guarantee stability. Now, I'd be really interested in seeing what you two think of that, because I follow Tanya's work really closely. I have a lot of respect for her. I don't always agree with her, but she always makes me think. And I found this piece very, very, very compelling. Maria, what are you? You're shaking your
I
head.
just want to quickly jump into, because today there was also a very interesting article published based on the study of the Russian elites, the survey that was run in March by Sharon Rivera and Henry Hale, two great scholars of Russia's elites. This is based on the regular every 2-year survey of Russian elites. And so what they find is that once these new amendments were announced, they find these contradictory changes among the Russian elites in perception of Russia's future. In some ways, of course, this has increased the certainty that Putin will stay in power, now almost indefinitely. But the interesting thing is that they actually find that the uncertainty has also increased among the elites. In particular, more people now answer the questions by saying don't know. On a given survey question. In particular, they find that when asked about the more political change in Russia, which, as we know, is needed, and based on other polls of the society more broadly, we know that people want change. So here we see that as a result of these amendments, the uncertainty of the Russian elites actually has increased. In particular, there's more uncertainty about the prospects for new independent parties in the parliament, the preferred balance of presidential and parliamentary power, the pressure that drove Putin to propose the amendments, and the relative benefits of the constitutional reforms even, right? So the Russian elites are precisely the people who you, as Putin, don't want to be more uncertain as to the relative benefits of the constitutional reforms as you are implementing those reforms. And this I find very interesting, and I think it complements nicely what Maxim just said, and also what Tatiana writes, that rather than actually sending more clear signals to the elites and avoiding to become a lame duck, which, as Putin personally has said was his intention, as a result of these amendments, we actually get the opposite results. There's more uncertainty. That's because even elites start realizing that's not the future Russia needs at the moment, and it cannot just indefinitely continue this way.
This means this is a very, I think, dangerous situation, because this regime is not going to fall just because of popular pressure. The street isn't enough, right? It's not going to fall just because of a so-called palace coup. That's not enough, really, but when you have both of those things, when you see Putin's support eroding among the population, and when you begin to see the elite looking around, I mean, I always thought they're going to be in trouble when a critical mass of the elite concludes that it is not in our interest anymore. It's more in our interest. The risk of changing Putin outweighs the benefits of keeping him, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we're near that point, right? Because it's really hard to gauge these things. And we could read people that follow the elite closely, like Tatiana and others. But we really, at the end of the day, we don't know. We really have to have a little bit of epistemological modesty about this, because as we say about Russia these days, the people that know don't talk, and the people that talk don't know. And if you know, having worked as a journalist in Russia in the 90s, when the people that did know actually talked, and you can actually get real information, that's night and day from today. We're in a very different situation. But my instinct, my spidey sense, my radar is telling me, it's not going to fall tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, but this is in a downward trajectory now. Max, would you agree with all of this, or what would you have to say about this?
Well, you see, to me, I don't really see that the regime is unstable right now, due to a very shrewd, I would say, and prudent management, especially financial management, and central bank doing really great job during the past years. During the period Russia has been under economic sanctions, Russia now has a really good fiscal position. Russia has a nice cushion in the National Wealth Fund, which is above 10% of GDP. Russia has the federal budget. Russia's federal budget is in surplus, and it is a quite comfortable surplus. Russia could have afforded a much bigger, by the way, just to mention that, a larger stimulus package than it actually did provide. So in that sense, the Kremlin is comfortable. Yes, Putin's approval rates have been going down for months now, and that I'm sure is a problem.
And living standards are falling.
Yes, that too. So we are kind of in a strange, balanced situation. But they do have an overwhelming, presence everywhere. The force they can use to suppress any popular movement is overwhelming. So I wouldn't be really thinking right now about any popular movements or any clash in kind of a direct
or any elite rebellion.
I wouldn't think about it. But I would mention this, which I think is kind of interesting. I've been thinking about it. One of the sort of spokespersons for the amendments is one Andrei Klishas, the member of Russia's upper chamber of parliament, the Federation Council. Andrei Klishas is his name. And he said that, to me, in a kind of a paradoxical way, he said that the amendments keeping Putin in place for a long time is for stability. And it's also would make the system less personalist. I think he said personified or something like that, which to me is really strange, because it does make it even more personalist or personified, or whatever word you use. In his thinking, apparently in the Kremlin's thinking, you basically postpone the decision. They do not have a mechanism of power transfer. They do not have a mechanism of wealth transfer, by the way, because wealth and power are very intimately related in Russia. So to me, what basically they decided to do right now is to put this decision again on hold, behind the horizon, don't think about it, and call it less personalist, less personal. Although in the actual normal logical world, this makes the system even more personalist, even more focused, and hinging, as it were, on Putin's personal decisions. And you kind of can feel Putin's thinking behind all this, because he is the person, as we know, for the past 20 years, we've learned a lot about the man. He does not like to make quick decisions. He would bide his time. He would wait until the very, very last moment all the time. That's his way of doing things. So to me, what he has done now is basically he postponed a decision to transfer power, to transfer the and wealth to an unknown, indefinite point in the future, in which, by the way, he may not already be around. So basically, it's wouldn't be out of, it wouldn't be a total fantasy to imagine that he would be postponing this all the time, and then basically some future leader that would succeed him in the future will have to deal with all the accumulated, unsolved, unresolved issues that he keeps sweeping under the rug.
No, you're absolutely right, Max. And I've been thinking this for a long time. I mean, this is not just putting Putin in danger. This is putting Russia in danger, quite frankly. And this is Russia's eternal problem, the problem of succession, right? There isn't a succession principle in Russia. Professor Timothy Snyder up at Yale writes about this very eloquently. But when you don't have a succession, the lack of a succession principle is dangerous. And sooner or later, there's going to have to be a succession. Putin is not immortal, right? No matter how many times he takes his shirt off, right, and rides a horse. That sooner or later, they're going to have to deal with this. And it's going to be messy because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think any Russian or Soviet regime has ever been as centralized around one person as this one is since Stalin, right? And so if you want to know what happens next, watch The Death of Stalin. that film they banned in Russia. Maria, you got the last word before we shift gears.
Very quickly, just to follow up on that, the succession principle and why Russia's regime is not very similar to Latin America. I wanted to respond to Maxim. And I see how the parallels are obvious, for example, with Hugo Chavez, of course. But the problem is with this comparison is in the Latin American countries, the succession, the precedents of succession have been established much more frequently. As a matter of fact, it's the stability of political leaders that is commonly harder to achieve there. For example, there's precedents that they keep changing constitution every single time, and there is a very strong turnover of the leaders primarily because of a much more powerful civil society in most of these countries. This is where, unfortunately, Russia is lagging behind in comparison to many of these countries, and that's why understanding Russia's personalistic regime is hard unless you count in this very demobilized society with the horrible tradition of Soviet system repressions, without any historical precedents or without many historical precedents for power alternation. This is why I keep arguing that when you look at the Russian regime and you want to understand how succession will occur, you need to compare it to either post-Soviet Eurasian regimes or to African neo-patrimonial regimes where society is comparatively passive as well.
Someday Maria is going to write an awesome book about that, and someday I'm going to buy and read that book, and we're going to talk about it on the Power Vertical podcast. On that note, we will shift gears. In a few moments, we will continue our discussion and shift gears, I said that twice, to look at how reports that Russian military intelligence paid bounties to Taliban militants to kill US and UK soldiers in Afghanistan. How's this thing playing in Russia? I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me from DC's lovely DuPont Circle neighborhood, just down the street from my lovely Adams Morgan neighborhood, is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow with SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from Vilnius, Lithuania, one of my favorite cities in the world, which I miss dearly, is veteran Russian journalist Maxim Trudolyubov, a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute and an editor at large at Meduza. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So the U.S. news cycle this week has been dominated by reports first appearing in the New York Times, but since matched by most major American news organizations, that a clandestine unit of the GRU, Unit 29155, paid militants in Afghanistan to kill U.S. soldiers. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit in this segment is not the details of this, because this has been poured over by many people, but more about how this is being played and presented in Russia, in the pro-Kremlin media, in the independent media, in the opposition media. I mean, I wrote about this earlier this week and noticed a couple of narratives that were popping up in the Russian media. One of them was a classic whataboutism narrative. First, they denied that this is true. The New York Times is Russophobic, and everybody understands that. But even if it's true, well, America would serve America right, because they gave the Afghan rebels Stinger missiles to kill Soviet soldiers in the 1980s, and which is true. And they supported the Chechen rebels in their, the Chechen terrorists in the 1990s, which is not true. But it doesn't matter if things are true or not. These are some of the big narratives I saw being put out there. But I'm just curious. I know you both, I follow the Russian media, but not nearly as closely as the two of you do. I was just curious of how you see this playing out. How is it being presented to the Russian public or to different Russian publics? Those that are consumers of, Первый Canal and those who are consumers of Meduza make two very radically different publics. How is this playing out? Either of you jump in. I'm actually curious to hear what both of you think about this. Max, why don't you go first?
Well, you see, I don't see it I don't see it as a big story in Russia. the Russian public has now been has been discussing the referendum, the
Right.
constitution. Those foreign policy, foreign conflict stories somehow are not really engaging Russian publics, at least to my knowledge. I see my friends opining about that on Facebook, of course, and joking and saying things like, "Why don't we go and help, North Korea with a bigger bomb or something like that?" But otherwise, I don't really see a big discussion. I don't think there is. I mean, that's my opinion. I don't think there is a language and a space to discuss that. Many Russians who are in Russia, they are very, very focused on the Russian thing, on whatever is happening inside. The cases, the comparisons are difficult because people really don't follow what's going on outside. Those Russians who live outside, they do have this benefit of comparing things, and they see the foreign media, but again, they're not inside, so they don't really form the part of that discussion. So at this point, I don't really see a big discussion.
Interesting.
I don't really see it, and I'm not sure it's playing out, either pro or anti Kremlin. It's just out there. In a way, people, I think, in Russia are used to stories coming from outside, where Russia is once again is a perpetrator of something that they have very vague idea about. So there's no much discussion, I'm afraid.
Interesting. I mean, that reflects, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to have this discussion, because I was looking around. I saw narratives taking hold in the Russian media, but you're right, Max. It is not a big story in Russia. It's a story. I mean, there was a piece in Izvestia early in the week. It was arguing that this way. I torture myself every day by reading Izvestia. I think I'm probably the only. I don't even think Russians read Izvestia every day. I read it because I like to know what the Kremlin is, how the Kremlin is messaging into that segment of the population. I also watch Kiselyov's show, which is also another form of torture. I should be able to get like some kind of compensation from the state for putting myself through this torture. But I want to know how the Kremlin's messaging. I want to, and so. But I read in Izvestia earlier this week about this, and it was playing it like, oh, this is just some domestic American politics thing where they're trying, it's Trump's enemies and things like that. That was the big narrative in Izvestia. I looked in other outlets. The Russian language version of Sputnik was putting out this narrative about, well, we didn't do this, but if we did, it would serve the Americans right because they've always killed Russians, like in Afghanistan or in Chechnya. So there you had that. You had a third narrative out there that, well, everybody knows how Russophobic the New York Times is. That was the other. They played a kind of the shoot the messenger. Maria, what are you seeing? You're here in America, where this is a huge story. You are also Russian. You have to be following this as closely as I am.
Yes, Brian, I actually also agree with both of you in the sense that it's not such a big deal in Russia, and they keep denying it using the conventional narratives, essentially, quote unquote, sam durak. So they keep accusing the United States of doing all kind of nasty things.
That's the Russian version of whataboutism, right?
Yeah. So why are you accusing us for something wrong? You are so
I know you
horrible.
are, but what am I? You're right.
Yourself. Also, the first channel broadcasted the argument that the U.S. intelligence considered that information invalid, which I don't think it's actually
false,
totally true. Yeah, exactly. Which is so again, that's a very conventional. There
were different opinions within the intelligence community about details.
Yeah.
But this rose to the level of getting into the Daily Brief, which is like serious.
Very serious, and of course very important in the United States, but of course the Russia's domestic messaging, they always pick one particular story that's more convenient for them, and that's what they show. It's interesting that they still deemed it important to make a whole report about it, so that's not nothing. And of course, just on the broader topic, once again, whether it's true or not, wouldn't be unprecedented, right? Considering everything we know about the Soviet active measures and how they commonly try to fund and back the organizations.
Oh, this fits a pattern, using proxies and cutouts, Unit 29155.
And also very commonly, these
all
terrorists.
sorts of things. The coup in Montenegro, destabilizing Moldova, the Skripal assassination. I mean,
and also the Soviet types of support. Just want to remind to our audience, right, that a lot of the continuity is also based on the fact that Russia preserved a lot of connections in these regions from the Soviet times, and so they inevitably sort of resort to the same instruments when the Cold War restarts again, because these are the groups who they have connections with. And in the past, Russia has been backing the organizations such as Palestine Liberation Organization, National Liberation Army of Bolivia, created by Che Guevara, the National Liberation Army of Colombia, etc., etc., etc. In the Soviet times. And because Russia's politics today, domestically and internationally, keeps becoming more and more like Soviet one, that would be, once again, nothing unimaginable at all.
I mean, that's all true. The thing for me that I found, I don't want to say shocking, but killing Americans is a threshold that is, that's an escalation that I can't imagine was taken lightly in the Kremlin. And that was the part of it that surprised me. All of the tactics, these things, no, they don't surprise me. And the activities of Unit 29155 have been so well documented that this fits their pattern of behavior, except for all the previous stuff I've written about them had been done in Europe. It was a destabilization campaign in Moldova, the coup attempt in Montenegro, the attempted assassination of Skripal, the attempted assassination of an arms dealer in Bulgaria. This was all well documented, but it was all in Europe. And now we're seeing that they're active in Afghanistan, which I guess that shouldn't surprise us very much. Max, you worked in Russian media at a very high editorial level. I mean, you were part of the glory days golden team at Vedomosti when it was my favorite Russian newspaper, and my required reading every day when I was living in Moscow in the 90s. And now you're an editor at large at Meduza. Imagine, I know you're not in the Russian Federation right now, but if you were in an editorial job in a Russian newspaper right now, imagine Vedomosti was still a respectable paper and had a normal publisher or someplace else. How would you approach this story if you, in an ideal world? I mean, how would you present this story to the Russian public?
Well, I will I will talk to people who are following it. I will try and find a good contributor who would produce an op-ed. We would probably write an editorial detailing the findings and quoting the responses. So we would just do a normal journalistic work. And my experience is that it wouldn't produce an amazing, discussion and a big splash.
It wouldn't be something that's too hot to touch?
It wouldn't. My view is that the Russian public, even that part that we reach at places like, or used to reach at places like Vedomosti, they do not, unfortunately, I don't know how to even describe that, but they do not really take these issues seriously enough. This is part of some kind of outside universe that does not really concern them too much. Yes, they might be interested. I mean, the situation with the MH17, the jumbo jet that's been downed over Ukraine, with the terrible, horrible crime in which Russia is, or some Russian actors are most likely, we think, or the investigation thinks, are perpetrators. this did not really produce a big, huge discussion back in the day when it started.
Except that headline in Novaya Gazeta that said,
right.
"Give us Holland."
Yes, I mean, of course, it was discussed, and it is still discussed. But what I'm trying to say is that this does not go to the level of really touching the national conscience, and producing the kind of conversation that pushes people, that moves them.
Interesting.
I do not really know the reasons for that. Maybe one needs. Maybe the situation will change in the future, and people will get to that discussion. My guess, one guess, which may very well be wrong, is that there is a mistrust of media, including of foreign media in Russia, and that is not just the Kremlin. It's much more. It's much broader.
It's the Russophobia argument, basically.
Yes, people do think, even, in a broad sense, the publics, they do think that foreign journalists are exaggerating, they don't understand Russia, that America has been doing things in the past, and whatever Putin's doing, he's just emulating America, and we have the right to do that. So all those arguments, they are not just the Kremlin's. They've been broadly accepted by many.
Mm-hmm.
So those may be one of those reasons why the discussion of those things, of terrible things like that, do not really go deep enough.
Right. It's fascinating because I was thinking, trying to think of analogs when I was living in Russia throughout the 90s, and I was thinking when the Bank of New York scandal broke in 1999. And 98, 99. 99, yeah. And I mean, I remember how that was covered prominently in the Russian press. And that, again, was a major, I mean, it's nothing compared to this, but it was a pretty major money laundering scandal. And it was members of the Russian elite and organized crime. And at the time, it was a super sexy story. And that was covered by the Russian media pretty extensively. And I didn't see so much of the whataboutism back then. It seemed to me that the Russian media at the time was trying to cover this story as honestly as possible. And I mean, that was a very different Russia, of course, and a very different media landscape. There was concern at the time, but I couldn't think of any other analogs. But it's fascinating to me how this thing is being looked at, because I was going into my work week expecting it to be dominated exclusively by Putin's plebiscite and the results of the referendum. And then this thing just came out broke last Friday night and blocked out the sun and became the most important story. And it's not only, it's dominating the Russian news. To me, it's one of these показательные stories. It really shows you something about how the Russian security services operate, particularly the GRU. I'm fascinated with Unit 29155 and their activities, and I'm fascinated with active measures in general. So it kind of got my attention, and then I started looking around what are the Russians writing about this? They're not writing that much. They're writing some things, and some of these things are predictable.
Yeah,
the Russophobia narrative, the whataboutism narrative, and that it's just American domestic politics there. Those are the three that I identified. But they seem to be just kind of ignoring the story largely.
GRU, I mean, to be honest, I mean, at least my impression is that GRU stories do not really fly in Russia, even including those previous ones, even those quite fascinating ones when GRU agents were discovered, de-anonymized, and whatever was happening, foreign assassination attempts. None of those stories really were close to people's hearts, as it were. I didn't. I wouldn't say. Yeah.
And on that note, we'll wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you, you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program at SIPA. And joining me from Washington, D.C.'s lovely DuPont Circle neighborhood, which is just down the street from my awesome Adams Morgan neighborhood, has been Maria Snegovaya, a fellow with SIPA's Russia Program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. And also joining us from Vilnius, Lithuania, one of the coolest cities in the world that I miss so much, has been veteran Russian journalist Maxim Trudolyubov, a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute and an editor at large for Meduza, one of my favorite news sources. Thank you both for an enlightening and lively discussion.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd also like to thank our awesome producer in the virtual control room, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on, all the complicated machines well-oiled and sanitized, and for fixing all my flubs and keeping everything in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with the ambient sound mix prepared by our production team for your enjoyment.